What was meant to be a lavish fifth anniversary dinner turned into the ultimate betrayal in a split second. My husband abruptly stood up from the head of the table, grabbed his crystal glass of ice water, and threw it right in my face. The freezing liquid dripped down my silk dress as he pointed toward the door. "You have until sunrise to pack your trash and get out of my house," he barked. I looked around the table. His parents, the highly respected pastor and first lady of our community, did not defend me. They actually applauded. My sister-in-law smirked and pulled out her phone. I stayed completely calm. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into my pocket, placed a small heavy key on the table, and said softly, "Then you have exactly 30 seconds. My name is Maya. I am 32 years old, and before I tell you how this night ended, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. If you have ever had to stand your ground against a toxic family who thought they could walk all over you, hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you will want to hear how I dismantled their entire world." The dining room of our Atlanta penthouse was suffocatingly quiet for just a moment. The crystal chandelier cast a harsh light on the puddle of water soaking into the expensive imported rug. Terrence stood there, his chest heaving, looking at me with absolute disgust. For 5 years, I had played the role of the supportive wife. I had smiled at his corporate events. I had attended his parents' megachurch every Sunday, sitting in the front row while they preached about family values and unconditional love. But behind closed doors, I was nothing but a target for their arrogance. Terrence slammed his empty glass onto the table. "Are you deaf, Maya?" I said. "Get out. I am done pretending your little computer games are a real job. You have been living under my roof, eating my food, and embarrassing this family for the last time." First Lady Brenda, wearing a designer suit I had secretly paid for last Christmas, delicately wiped her mouth with a linen napkin. "Terrence is right, Maya. We have prayed on this. You lack the grace and submission required for a man of his stature. You should be grateful he gave a girl from your background a taste of the good life." Pastor James nodded solemnly, cutting his steak as if he had not just watched his son assault his wife. Then there was Chloe. She was married to Terrence's brother Darren. Chloe always played the role of the progressive ally, the sweet white daughter-in-law, who just wanted everyone to get along while quietly making sure she remained the favorite. She leaned across the table with a pitiful pout. "Oh, honey, do you need me to call you an Uber? I can pay for it if your little startup is struggling. It is the least I can do. The streets are dangerous at night." They all looked at me, waiting for the breakdown. They expected me to cry, to beg for another chance to apologize for whatever imaginary offense I had committed this time. They truly believed I was a financially dependent wife, clinging to Terrence and his position as a vice president at a local credit union. They had no idea that my little tech startup was actually a rapidly expanding financial technology firm. They had no idea I had spent the last 2 years quietly building an empire, while Terrence spent his time and his money trying to impress the Atlanta elite. I slowly picked up my linen napkin and dabbed the cold water from my cheeks. I looked at Terrence, whose arrogant sneer was beginning to falter just a fraction under my silent stare. I reached into my blazer, pulled out a small brass key, and dropped it onto the mahogany table. The metallic clink echoed loudly in the tense room. "What is this garbage?" Terrence sneered, though his eyes darted nervously to the key. "Are you trying to give back your house key? We are changing the locks anyway." I smiled. It was a cold, empty smile. "That is not a house key, Terrence. That is the physical override key for the central security system. You see, when you secretly took out a second and third mortgage on this penthouse to fund your luxury car obsession and those expensive weekend trips you claimed were for business, you probably thought the bank would just give you endless extensions. You thought your father being a prominent pastor would save you from foreclosure." Terrence turned pale. His mouth opened, but no words came out. First Lady Brenda stopped chewing her food. The smug look on Chloe's face vanished instantly. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "The bank did foreclose Terrence. Yesterday, to be exact. And my investment firm bought the debt this morning. The deed was transferred at 10 in the morning. So technically you are trespassing in my home. And since you threw water in my face, I decided to activate the silent alarm right before I sat down for dinner. I tapped my smartwatch. That was exactly 4 minutes and 30 seconds ago. The police response time in this neighborhood is about 5 minutes. So like I said, you have about 30 seconds before they breach that door. The room erupted into sheer chaos. Terrence stumbled backward, knocking his heavy dining chair to the floor. You are lying. You do not have that kind of money. You are just a pathetic coder. Pastor James stood up, his booming preacher voice echoing off the walls. Now see here, Maya. This is family business. You cannot just buy a house out from under your husband. There are laws against this kind of deceit. Laws that your son broke when he forged my signature on the initial loan documents? I replied calmly, never breaking eye contact with Terrence. Chloe scrambled to her feet, dropping her expensive purse on the floor. Her sweet, condescending facade completely dissolved into sheer panic. This is ridiculous, she shrieked, her voice shrill and trembling. Terrence, tell her she is lying. We cannot be associated with a police raid. My father is playing golf with the chief of police tomorrow. I will call him right now and have this stopped. I watched them scramble like rats on a sinking ship. Terrence rushed toward the hallway, desperately trying to punch the code into the security panel on the wall, but the screen was completely locked out. The red light was already blinking steadily, counting down their final moments of absolute arrogance. Brenda was clutching her chest, dramatically swaying, as if the Holy Spirit was about to catch her, while Pastor James grabbed his suit jacket, muttering words that definitely were not in the Bible. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, red and blue lights suddenly began flashing, reflecting off the glass and washing the entire penthouse in an ominous glow. The loud, piercing wail of police sirens tore through the quiet night, stopping right outside our private elevator gate. Heavy boots pounded against the corridor floor, followed by a thunderous knock that rattled the heavy wooden door. The 30 seconds were up. The heavy oak door of our penthouse swung open with a forceful thud. 4 uniformed police officers stepped into the foyer, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts. The flashing blue and red lights from the hallway illuminated their stern faces, casting long, dramatic shadows across the expensive hardwood floor. The sheer gravity of their presence immediately sucked the remaining air out of the room. Chloe did not miss a beat. She immediately pushed her way past Terrence, smoothing down her designer skirt. She plastered on a look of distressed innocence, her eyes wide and pleading, and marched right up to the lead officer. Her tone completely shifted from the shrill, condescending panic she had just directed at me to the smooth, authoritative cadence of someone who had never been told no in her entire life. This was Chloe in her element. She had spent years perfecting this routine. She always played the role of the progressive ally at dinner parties, but the moment things got tense, she weaponized her tears and her status without hesitation. Officers, thank goodness you arrived so quickly, Chloe said, her voice shaking just enough to sound vulnerable. My name is Chloe Sterling. My father is Richard Sterling, the real estate developer. I believe he plays golf with your captain. We have a very disturbed individual here. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at me. This woman is having some sort of mental breakdown. She is trespassing on my brother-in-law's property and making wild threats against our family. She is refusing to leave, and honestly, she is acting very aggressive. We need her removed from the premises immediately. She might even need a psychiatric hold. I did not move an inch. I just sat there, swirling the last sip of wine in my crystal glass, watching Chloe direct the scene. She truly believed her complexion and her father's country club membership gave her supreme authority over any situation. She expected the officers to immediately march over, grab my arms, and drag me out into the night just because she demanded it. But the officers did not move toward me. They did not even reach for their radios. Instead, they stepped aside as a fifth man walked through the front door. It was Chief Miller. He was a towering, no-nonsense man who had spent 30 years on the Atlanta police force. He took off his hat, surveyed the chaotic, water-soaked dining room, and then his eyes landed directly on me. Good evening, Ms. Maya. Chief Miller said, his voice deeply respectful and perfectly calm. I received the priority 1 alert from your central system. Is everything secure here? Are you in any physical danger? Chloe blinked rapidly, her mouth hanging open in utter confusion. Wait, what are you doing? She stammered, stepping closer to the chief. I just told you she is trespassing. She does not own this place. My brother-in-law does. You need to grab her and get her out of here. Chief Miller slowly turned his head and looked down at Chloe. The absolute lack of patience in his eyes made her take a sudden step backward. Ma'am, I strongly suggest you lower your voice and step back from me, he said coldly. You are currently standing inside a property entirely owned by Apex Financial Holdings, and the chief executive officer of that company is sitting right there at that table. He gestured respectfully toward me before continuing. Ms. Maya's firm also happens to manage the retirement portfolios for the entire Atlanta Police Department. She single-handedly saved our pension fund from a catastrophic market loss last year. So when her private security system triggers a top-tier intrusion alert, I come myself to make sure she is safe. Now, Ms. Maya. He turned his attention back to me. Do you want these individuals escorted off your premises quietly, or would you prefer we use handcuffs? The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the soaked imported rug. Chloe stumbled backward as if she had been physically struck by a heavy blow. Her face turned an alarming shade of crimson and her shoulders slumped. The privilege she had wielded like a weapon her entire life had just shattered into a million tiny pieces against the solid, undeniable wall of my actual power. For the first time in her life, her father's name meant absolutely nothing. She looked frantically at Terrence for help, desperate for someone to validate her reality, but Terrence was completely unraveling. He grabbed his own hair, pacing frantically around the dining table, knocking over empty wine glasses. No, 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 this is impossible, Terrence shouted, spit flying from his lips. His expensive suit looked wrinkled and pathetic now. You cannot own this house, Maya. The bank was satisfied. I paid the debt. I paid the debt last week. I fixed it. I placed my wine glass on the table and finally stood up. I smoothed the wrinkles from my silk dress, enjoying the sound of my heels clicking against the hardwood as I walked slowly toward him. The police officers watched quietly, giving me the floor. You did not pay the bank, Terrence, I said, my voice cutting through his panic like a surgical blade. You paid the loan sharks you owed money to from your failed underground sports betting ventures. You were terrified they were going to break your leg, so you paid them first. But the bank still needed their money for the multiple secret mortgages you defaulted on. Terrence was hyperventilating now. His eyes were wide, darting around the room like a trapped animal looking for an escape route that did not exist. I paid the sharks so I could stay alive, he screamed, completely forgetting who was standing in the room. But I had a plan for the bank. I fixed it. I took $200,000 from the church building fund. I wired it to the offshore broker. He promised to stall the foreclosure for another 6 months. The money is gone. I took it from the church account. The house should be safe. The moment the words left his mouth, the temperature in the room plummeted to freezing. Terrence clapped both hands over his mouth, his eyes bulging in sheer terror as he realized a second too late what he had just confessed. He had just screamed his guilt in a room full of police officers, and much worse, right in front of his parents. Pastor James grabbed the back of a heavy wooden chair to keep himself from collapsing to the floor. His face turned an ashen, sickly gray. First Lady Brenda let out a strangled, breathless gasp. She clutched her expensive pearl necklace so tightly that the strings snapped. The tiny white beads rained down, scattering across the hardwood floor with a sound like shattering glass. Their perfect golden child, the son they had constantly compared me to. The man they believed was an upright, successful banking executive had just admitted to a massive felony. He had embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from the faithful, hard-working congregation that trusted them with their spiritual and financial lives. The upcoming church audit would not just ruin their reputation, it would send their son to federal prison and likely drag the pastor down with him. The broker you paid was a fraud, Terence, I said softly, stepping right into his personal space so he could not look away from me. He took your stolen church money and vanished into thin air. And the bank sold the debt to my firm for pennies on the dollar. You risked everything. You stole from your own father's congregation to save your fragile pride, and you still lost. Chief Miller unclipped the handcuffs from his heavy utility belt. He took a slow, deliberate step toward Terence. Mr. Terence, based on the financial confession you just made in the presence of law enforcement, I am going to have to ask you to turn around and place your hands behind your back. Terence began to sob openly, a pathetic, loud wailing sound that echoed through the penthouse. Pastor James looked like he was about to faint, while Chloe frantically pressed her back against the wall, trying to make herself invisible. The perfect, arrogant family that had mocked me and told me to get out of their house just 10 minutes ago was now completely destroyed. Chief Miller reached out to grab Terrence's wrist. But before the cold steel of the handcuffs could click into place, the heavy front door burst open once again. The heavy front door did not just open, it was practically shoved off its hinges. A young woman in her early 20s stumbled into the foyer, dragging a massive pink designer suitcase behind her. She was wearing a tight maternity dress that prominently displayed a heavily pregnant belly, maybe 7 or 8 months along. Her makeup was perfectly done, though she had managed to squeeze out a few strategic tears that were currently rolling down her cheeks. She completely ignored the 4 armed police officers standing in the entryway, pushing past them as if they were nothing more than hotel bellhops. "Terence, baby, is she gone yet?" The young woman whined, her high-pitched voice echoing terribly in the tense room. "You promised me she would be packed and out by 9. The moving company is coming tomorrow morning to bring my furniture, and I cannot wait any longer. My back is killing me, and our baby needs a proper home to settle into." Terence froze entirely. The metal handcuffs were still hovering mere inches from his wrists. Chief Miller raised a thick gray eyebrow, pausing his movements and taking a slow step back to let this new spectacular disaster unfold. He crossed his arms over his chest, clearly realizing that the financial crime he was about to arrest Terence for was suddenly taking a back seat to a massive domestic implosion. I sat back in my chair and watched the performance. This was Sasha. I had known her name, her address, and her favorite brand of overpriced iced coffee for over 6 months, but seeing her standing in my foyer, demanding my home, was a new level of audacity. Brenda, who just moments ago had been gasping for air over the realization that her son had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from their church, suddenly snapped out of her panic. She locked her eyes onto Sasha's swollen belly. In Brenda's deeply twisted and hypocritical mind, this was a lifeline. A grandbaby. A male heir to carry on the family name. It was the perfect distraction, a convenient excuse to justify all of Terrence's sins. Brenda pushed past her paralyzed husband and rushed to Sasha's side, aggressively wrapping her arms around the younger woman's shoulders. "Oh, you poor, sweet girl," Brenda cooed, her voice dripping with a sudden sickening affection. "Are you carrying my grandson?" "Terence, why did you not tell us you were blessed with a child?" Brenda turned her furious, tear-stained face back to me, her posture suddenly radiating righteous indignation. "This changes everything, Maya. My son has a real family to provide for now. A child on the way. You have been too focused on your career to give him what a man truly needs. If Terence is too much of a gentleman to physically throw you out of this apartment so the mother of his child can rest, then I will do it myself. You are nothing but a cold, bitter woman standing in the way of God blessing." Pastor James quickly chimed in, desperately trying to salvage any shred of a positive narrative to distract from his son's impending felony charges. "A child is a gift from the Lord," he boomed, adjusting his suit jacket. "We must protect the innocent. Maya, you need to be reasonable and step aside." Chloe saw her opening. She smoothed her blonde hair, adjusted her posture, and stepped forward, putting on her softest, most diplomatic voice. She loved playing the sophisticated mediator. She honestly thought her advice was a gift from above. Maya, listen to me, let us be adults about this. You are a modern, successful woman. You do not need this kind of ugly public scandal. Just agree to an uncontested divorce right now. You can split the assets 50-50, sell this penthouse, and walk away quietly. It is the dignified thing to do. Do not drag this out in court and ruin Terrence's life when he has a new baby on the way. Just take half and leave. I looked at Chloe, then at Brenda, who was practically shielding Sasha like a protective mother hen. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger. I simply walked over to the side table, picked up my sleek leather briefcase, and snapped the brass latches open. The sharp click echoed through the room, drawing everyone's attention. Split the assets. I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the heavy air. Chloe, you really should stop giving legal and financial advice when you have never earned a single paycheck that did not come from your father's trust fund. Terrence and I are not splitting anything. Terrence's eyes widened in absolute terror. Maya, please do not do this, he whispered, his voice cracking. I pulled a thick, legally bound document from my briefcase and dropped it onto the dining table right next to the brass security key. This is our prenuptial agreement, I announced clearly. Signed, notarized, and completely ironclad. Terrence always told you all that I was desperate to marry him to elevate my social status. But the truth is, the board of directors at my financial firm insisted on this document before I was even allowed to walk down the aisle. They needed to protect the company assets from exactly this kind of liability. I tapped my perfectly manicured fingernail against the thick paper. Section 4, Paragraph 2, clearly outlines the infidelity clause. It explicitly states that if either party commits adultery, they immediately forfeit any and all claims to marital assets. That includes real estate investment portfolios, retirement accounts, and liquid cash. Furthermore, the guilty party assumes 100% of all joint debts incurred during the marriage. I looked directly into Terrence's panicked eyes. So Terrence does not get 50% of this penthouse. He gets absolutely zero. And he leaves this marriage carrying the entire weight of those multiple secret mortgages he took out. He is walking out of that door tonight with nothing but the clothes on his back and millions of dollars in debt. Sasha stopped crying instantly. She pushed herself away from Brenda's embrace and stared at Terrence in sheer horror. Wait, what is she talking about? Sasha demanded, her voice losing its innocent whine and becoming sharp. You have no money. You told me you were a millionaire. You told me you owned this whole building and that you were kicking her out so I could have the master suite. Are you broke? Brenda gasped, clutching her chest again, as the reality of her son's financial ruin truly set in. But before any of them could formulate another excuse, I reached into my briefcase one last time. I was not finished. I had one more card to play, and I was going to make sure it destroyed every remaining illusion in that room. I pulled out a standard white medical envelope. I held it up so the bright light of the chandelier caught the embossed logo of one of the most exclusive private testing clinics in Atlanta. I have known about you for over 6 months, Sasha. I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. I hired a private investigator the very first time Terrence came home, smelling like cheap vanilla perfume. My investigator followed you to your favorite shopping spots, to your apartment, and right into the waiting room of your prenatal appointments. And since Terrence is an incredibly heavy sleeper, it was remarkably easy to swab the inside of his cheek for a DNA sample one night. Terrence's jaw dropped open. He looked like he was going to be sick right there on the rug. I sent his sample to the lab along with some medical waste my investigator legally retrieved from the trash outside your clinic. I continued, my gaze shifting from Terrence to the young mistress. I tossed the white envelope onto the mahogany table. It slid right over the prenuptial agreement and stopped exactly at the edge, perfectly positioned in front of Brenda. You might want to read that document carefully before you start planning a lavish baby shower. First Lady Brenda, I said softly. Because according to that certified lab report, Terrence is not the father of that child. First Lady Brenda stared at the white envelope as if it were a venomous snake. Her heavily ringed fingers trembled violently as she reached out and pulled the crisp laboratory report from inside. The room was so devastatingly quiet that the simple rustle of the paper sounded like a gunshot. Pastor James leaned over her shoulder, his eyes darting frantically across the black and white text. I watched the exact moment the truth registered in their minds. Brenda let out a hollow, suffocating gasp. The paper slipped from her hands and fluttered down onto the wet mahogany table. Terence leaned forward, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. "If I am not the father, then who is he?" demanded, his voice cracking with a mixture of betrayal and desperate hope that he might somehow be off the hook. I did not answer him. I simply shifted my gaze to the far end of the dining room, right toward the shadows near the hallway. Darren had been standing there silently for the past 20 minutes. Terrence's younger brother had spent the entire evening comfortably hiding behind the chaos, letting his brother take the full force of my wrath. But there was nowhere left to hide now. Darren's face was the color of chalk. He was staring at Sasha with wide, terrified eyes, shaking his head slightly as if begging her to keep her mouth shut. Sasha, however, had zero loyalty to a sinking ship. When she saw the police officers stepping closer and realized Terrence was absolutely penniless, her survival instincts kicked in. She pointed a manicured finger straight at Darren. "He told me he was the vice president of the bank." Sasha screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the glass windows. "He drove the Mercedes. He paid the rent on my apartment. He told me Terrence was just the middle management loser of the family and that he was the one with the real money. He promised he was going to leave his wife for me before the baby was born." The absolute destruction of the perfect moral family was instantaneous. Chloe snatched the lab report off the table. Her eyes scanned the official DNA match, confirming Darren as the father. The sophisticated, progressive, sweet daughter-in-law facade completely disintegrated. The polite smile she used to mask her deep-rooted superiority complex melted away, replaced by pure, unadulterated rage. Chloe let out a sound that I can only describe as a feral shriek. It was a guttural scream of absolute humiliation. She dropped her expensive designer purse and lunged across the dining room directly at her husband. "You worthless, lying parasite!" Chloe screamed, her perfectly styled blonde hair flying wildly around her face as she slapped Darren across the cheek with a resounding crack. "I bought that Mercedes for you. My father gave you that fake executive job at his firm because you were too incompetent to pass the licensing exams on your own. I paid off your college loans. I funded your entire pathetic existence." Darren stumbled backward, raising his arms to protect his face as Chloe relentlessly attacked him. "Chloe, please let me explain. It meant nothing," he pleaded pathetically, tripping over the edge of the soaked imported rug. "It meant nothing," Chloe shrieked, turning her furious gaze toward Sasha, who was now awkwardly trying to hide behind one of the police officers. "You humiliated me for her. You cheated on me with a girl carrying a cheap knockoff bag and a discount maternity dress." Chloe completely lost her mind. She lunged toward Sasha, her manicured hands curled into claws. Two of the police officers immediately had to step in, grabbing Chloe by the arms and dragging her backward as she kicked and screamed like a wild animal. "Let me go!" Chloe yelled at the officers, her voice entirely stripped of the polite respect she had shown them just 10 minutes earlier. "Do you know who my father is? I will have your badges for touching me." Chief Miller did not even blink. "Ma'am, if you do not calm down this instant, you will be leaving this penthouse in handcuffs right next to your brother-in-law," he warned, his deep voice easily cutting through her hysteria. Chloe collapsed onto one of the dining chairs, sobbing uncontrollably, her perfect makeup running down her face in dark streaks. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with venom and devastating embarrassment. This was the same woman who used to hand me her coats at family gatherings, treating me like the hired help. This was the woman who constantly made passive-aggressive comments about my natural hair, my modest upbringing, and how lucky I was to be welcomed into such a prestigious, wealthy family. She had built her entire identity on being the affluent savior of a troubled family, looking down on me from her imaginary pedestal. Now, Here she was, publicly shattered, realizing her husband had been using her trust fund to finance a secret life with a woman who had absolutely nothing. I sat back in my chair, crossing my legs and resting my hands on my lap. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I looked down at them all from where I sat. They looked like a beautiful, fragile glass sculpture that had been violently smashed with a hammer. For 5 years they had gaslighted me. They had made me feel like I was the crazy one, the ungrateful one, the outsider who could never measure up to their righteous standards. First Lady Brenda and Pastor James had stood behind pulpits every Sunday preaching about integrity and the sanctity of marriage while their sons lived lives of absolute deceit and corruption. They covered for each other. They lied for each other. They believed their status made them completely untouchable. But I had not just touched them. I had completely uprooted their foundation and burned it to the ground. Terence was still handcuffed, weeping loudly on the floor. Darren was bleeding from a scratch on his cheek, cowering in the corner away from his hysterical wife. Sasha was crying behind a police officer, demanding that someone call her a cab because her feet hurt. Brenda was slumped over the dining table, her face buried in her arms as she moaned prayers into the wet wood. I looked at Chief Miller and gave him a brief, respectful nod. "I think we are done here, Chief. Please remove these trespassers from my property." Chief Miller signaled to his officers. "All right, party is over. Everyone towards the elevator. Mr. Terrence, you are coming with us to the precinct. The rest of you grab your belongings and vacate the premises immediately." The officers began ushering the broken family toward the door. Darren tried to reach out to Chloe, but she viciously swatted his hand away and stormed out of the apartment without looking back. Sasha waddled out behind her, still dragging her massive pink suitcase, complaining loudly about the service. Pastor James slowly pushed himself up from the table. He looked 20 years older than he had when the dinner started. His shoulders were heavily slumped, and the arrogant, booming preacher persona was entirely gone. He helped his wife to her feet. Brenda could not even look me in the eye. She stared at the floor, completely broken. James turned to me, his voice a trembling whisper. "You have destroyed this family, Maya. May God forgive you for the vengeance in your heart." I smiled, a cold, unwavering expression. "God has nothing to do with this, James. You built a house of cards on a foundation of lies. I just opened the window and let the wind blow." He turned toward the door to follow his disgraced wife and his arrested son out of my home. But just as he took his first step toward the foyer, the sharp, piercing ringtone of his cell phone shattered the heavy silence. James stopped in his tracks. He slowly reached into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his phone. He stared at the caller identification on the screen. His hand began to shake so violently that he nearly dropped the device. He pressed the phone to his ear, his face draining of whatever color it had left. "Hello," he whispered weakly. I watched his eyes widen in absolute horror. He stopped breathing. The voice on the other end was faint, but authoritative, speaking in sharp, clipped sentences. James staggered backward, bracing himself against the doorframe to keep from collapsing. "Yes, this is Pastor James," he stammered, his voice completely devoid of strength. "Frozen." "What do you mean the accounts are frozen? We have a Sunday service to run. You cannot just lock down the church." He listened for another few seconds, and then the final blow landed. His knees buckled slightly. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation." James repeated the words, tumbling out of his mouth like a death sentence. "Money laundering. But I do not know anything about offshore accounts. My son was managing the building fund." I picked up my glass of wine, took a slow, deliberate sip, and watched the great Pastor James realize that Terrence's reckless embezzlement had not just cost them a penthouse, it had just brought the federal government crashing down on the sanctuary they used to hide all their sins. The phone slipped from Pastor James' trembling fingers and clattered harshly onto the wet hardwood floor. He did not even attempt to bend down and retrieve it. The great spiritual leader, a man who commanded the absolute attention of thousands of devoted followers every Sunday morning, now looked like a hollow shell of a human being. His broad shoulders sagged and his chest heaved as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. The federal government was knocking on his sanctuary doors, and he knew exactly whose fault it was. Chief Miller did not give the pastor any time to process the devastating news of the frozen accounts and the money laundering investigation. The chief snapped his fingers and his 3 remaining officers immediately moved in to clear the room. Terrence was yanked upward by his biceps. His expensive custom-tailored suit jacket bunched up around his neck, making him look sloppy and completely pathetic. His designer leather shoes scuffed loudly against the floorboards as he was dragged toward the entryway. He was no longer the arrogant banking executive who had thrown a glass of ice water in my face just an hour ago. He was a weeping, terrified child who had finally run out of other people money to hide behind. But as the officers pushed him into the brightly lit hallway, a sudden desperate surge of his old toxic narcissism flared up. His survival instinct kicked in, and his ego absolutely refused to accept the reality of his downfall. "You cannot do this to me!" Terrence screamed, thrashing his shoulders aggressively against the tight grip of the 2 large officers. "I am a vice president of a major financial institution. My father is Pastor James. You are making a massive mistake. You are going to lose your badges for this." Chief Miller simply walked past him and pushed the elevator button. The brushed steel doors slid open immediately. "We will see what a federal judge has to say about your employment status tomorrow morning, Mr. Terrence," the chief replied dryly, completely unfazed by the tantrum. "Step inside the elevator. Do not make me add resisting arrest to your charges." First Lady Brenda had to be physically supported by her husband just to walk. She was moaning softly, murmuring a continuous frantic stream of prayers and desperate denials under her breath. They stumbled out of my penthouse without even asking to grab their expensive cashmere coats from the hall closet. They did not look back at me. They simply kept their eyes fixed on the floor, drowning in their own overwhelming shame. The heavy oak door finally swung shut behind them, and the deadbolt locked automatically with a heavy, satisfying thud. The sudden silence in the apartment was deafening. It was broken only by the faint rhythmic hum of the Atlanta city traffic far below. I stood completely alone in my expansive dining room. The puddle of cold water on the imported rug was still there, a pathetic visual reminder of how this evening had started. I walked over to the table, picked up my favorite bottle of dark red wine, and poured myself a fresh glass. I took my time. I enjoyed the quiet. I walked slowly across the room, pushed open the heavy glass doors, and stepped out onto the wide balcony. The cool night air washed over my face. The city skyline sparkled with thousands of lights, a vast sea of power, money, and influence. I walked to the edge of the thick glass railing, rested my hands on the cool metal, and looked straight down at the street level 20 stories below. 3 police cruisers were parked haphazardly, right in front of my luxury building lobby. Their flashing blue and red lights painted the concrete pavement and the surrounding landscaping in a frantic, chaotic rhythm. A small crowd of late-night dog walkers, security guards, and wealthy neighbors had already gathered on the sidewalk. They were holding up their glowing smartphones, eagerly recording the spectacular late-night drama. I watched as the officers forcefully shoved Terrence out of the lobby doors and into the humid night air. He was actively struggling now, fighting violently to keep his face hidden from the glaring camera lenses of the bystanders, but his bright blue suit made him an unmistakable glowing target. Pastor James and Brenda trailed a few steps behind him, holding their hands over their faces like disgraced celebrities caught in a massive tabloid scandal. Suddenly, Terrence stopped fighting the officers. He planted his feet firmly on the pavement and looked up. Out of all the balconies towering above him, in the massive residential high-rise, his eyes locked directly onto mine. Even from 20 stories up, I could feel the desperate, venomous rage radiating from him. He realized he was losing his home, his mistress, his money, and his freedom all in one night. But his massive ego still firmly believed that the religious empire his family had built over decades was invincible. "Maya," he screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing loudly up the concrete canyon of the street. "You think you won! You think you can steal my property and get away with this!" The officers tried to push his head down to force him into the back seat of the cruiser, but Terrence braced his legs against the doorframe. He aggressively twisted his body around to keep screaming up at my balcony. "I will completely destroy you," Terrence roared, his face twisted in absolute fury and desperation. "I am going to get on camera tomorrow and tell the whole world what a manipulative, lying fraud you really are. My father congregation will ruin your business. We have thousands of people who will drag your name through the mud. You are going to be nothing but a gold-digging villain on every social media page in this city. You messed with the wrong family. God will strike you down for what you did to us tonight." He was still screaming wildly, as Chief Miller finally lost his patience. The chief grabbed Terrence firmly by the back of his collar and shoved him forcefully into the back seat of the police car. The heavy door slammed shut, instantly cutting off his pathetic, echoing threats. I stood perfectly still on the balcony, slowly swirling the dark red wine in my glass. I watched the police cruisers pull away from the curb, their sirens wailing loudly into the distance, carrying my soon-to-be ex-husband off to a dirty downtown holding cell. The small crowd of neighbors slowly dispersed, buzzing with fresh, juicy gossip. Pastor James and Brenda were left standing on the curb entirely alone. They were frantically trying to hail a regular city cab since they had arrived in Terrence's luxury car, which was now parked in my secure garage. I took a slow sip of my wine, savoring the rich, bold flavor. Terrence actually thought he could win a public relations war against me. He genuinely believed that his father megachurch and their massive army of devout followers would automatically take his side. I knew exactly how his family operated. I knew the culture of their church inside and out. They were planning to play the ultimate victim card. They would use the pulpit to paint me as the aggressive, bitter woman who had ruthlessly stolen his hard-earned wealth and broken up a blessed family. He thought his religious facade was a bulletproof vest. He had no idea that I had already loaded the gun. I turned around, walked back into my quiet, peaceful penthouse, and slid the heavy glass door shut, locking the city noise out completely. I walked over to the marble kitchen island and picked up my cell phone. I bypassed my personal contacts and opened my encrypted corporate messaging application. I tapped the name of my lead IT director, Marcus. He was a brilliant cybersecurity expert who had been quietly monitoring the church financial servers ever since I first suspected Terrence was moving large sums of money around to hide his gambling debts. The phone rang exactly twice before he answered. "Good evening, Boss Marcus," said his voice crisp, professional, and completely awake despite the late hour. "I saw the priority security alert trigger at your primary residence. Is everything handled on your end?" "Everything is perfectly handled, Marcus," I replied smoothly. "The penthouse is secure and Terrence is currently en route to the downtown police precinct to be booked." "Excellent news," Marcus said, the sound of a keyboard clacking softly in the background. "What is our next move?" I walked back into the dining room and stared down at the puddle of water Terrence had thrown at me. He had promised to destroy my name. He had promised to weaponize his church congregation to smear my reputation across the entire city. Terrence and his parents are going to try and control the narrative by tomorrow morning. I told Marcus, my voice cold and calculated. They are going to hold an emergency press conference at the church probably by the end of the week to cry to their congregation and play the innocent victims of a greedy wife. They will try to use their massive social media following to launch a targeted smear campaign against me and the financial firm. "I understand," Marcus replied instantly. "Do you want me to deploy the firewalls and block their access to the church broadcasting networks? I can lock them out of all their social media accounts tonight." I smiled. "No. Do exactly the opposite. Let them set the stage. Let them gather their entire audience. I want them to feel completely confident that they are winning the public opinion war." I paused, making sure my next words were crystal clear. "But I need you to bypass the central security firewall on the church main audio-visual system. Get full remote access into the giant projection screens behind the main pulpit. Then I want you to access Terrence's private cloud storage. Pull all the hidden offshore banking receipts. Pull the text messages he sent to his mistress mocking the church elders. Pull the financial statements showing he bought her designer bags using the church building fund. and grab the high-definition security footage from that underground betting club he frequents downtown. Bundle it all into one massive, undeniable presentation. Consider it done. Marcus said, the typing on his end growing faster. I will build a remote trigger. When do we deploy the package? I will give you the signal when they are broadcasting live, I said. Just make sure the feed cannot be overridden or shut down from their sound booth once it starts playing. Start gathering the data, Marcus. I want them crying on television. Exactly 7 days later, the trap was fully set. Terrence had managed to post bail after spending a terrifying 48 hours in the county jail, likely draining the very last of his father's legitimate savings to do it. As I had predicted, his family did not retreat into the shadows to reflect on their sins. Instead, they went on the offensive. They activated the massive, well-oiled public relations machine of their megachurch. It was a Tuesday morning when the notification popped up on my iPad. The church officials' social media pages, which boasted hundreds of thousands of followers across the country, had suddenly gone live. The broadcast was dramatically titled, "A Season of Testing." I sat behind the massive mahogany desk in my corner office at Apex Financial Holdings. The floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a panoramic view of the bustling Atlanta skyline, a stark contrast to the claustrophobic manufactured drama playing out on my screen. I picked up my porcelain cup, took a slow sip of my vanilla latte, and turned up the volume on my tablet. Pastor James stood at the center of the massive wooden pulpit. He wore a simple, unadorned charcoal suit today, intentionally ditching his usual flashy gold watches and diamond rings to project an image of humble suffering. First Lady Brenda sat in a high-backed velvet chair just behind him, dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a white lace tissue. Terence stood to his father's right side, looking down at his expensive shoes like a repentant, heartbroken victim of cruel circumstance. And surprisingly, standing right next to Terence, holding his arm in a bizarre display of unyielding family solidarity, was Chloe. I almost laughed out loud when I saw her. Just a week ago, she was screaming like a wild animal, ready to tear her own husband apart for getting a younger woman pregnant. But Chloe was nothing if not a brilliant opportunist. She had quickly realized that divorcing a publicly disgraced penniless man would severely damage her own pristine brand as the perfect affluent wife. Her father's real estate firm relied heavily on the church political connections and its wealthy congregation. So she chose to pivot. She was now playing the role of the forgiving, fiercely loyal sister-in-law who was standing bravely by her family during a vicious spiritual attack. Pastor James leaned heavily into the microphone. His deep, resonant voice was thick with manufactured emotion. Church family, we come to you today not from a place of pride, but from a valley of deep sorrow. He began bowing his head. The devil works hardest when God is preparing a breakthrough, and right now the enemy is using someone we loved, someone we welcomed into our home with open arms, to try and tear down the legacy of this ministry. He did not mention the money laundering investigation. He did not mention his son's pregnant mistress or the DNA test. Instead, he painted a masterful, entirely fabricated picture of absolute victimhood. He claimed that I was a ruthless, corporate-obsessed woman who had manipulated his son's finances, secretly buying their marital home just to throw him onto the street in the middle of the night. He told his congregation that I had used my connections in the financial technology industry to freeze their church accounts and frame his innocent son for financial mismanagement. Then it was Terrence's turn to speak. He stepped up to the microphone, gripping the edges of the wooden podium so hard his knuckles turned white. He looked directly into the camera, squeezing out a single calculated tear. I loved my wife, Terrence said, his voice trembling with fake grief. I worked day and night to provide a beautiful life for her. But Maya was never satisfied. The corporate world changed her. It made her cold. It made her greedy. When I tried to counsel her, when I tried to bring her back to the values of this church, she retaliated. She used her wealth to steal the roof over my head. She is trying to destroy my father ministry just to silence us. But we will not be silenced. Chloe stepped up right behind him, resting her hand gently on his shoulder. She looked into the camera with her big blue eyes, utilizing her tears with lethal precision. As a woman who married into this wonderful family, it breaks my heart to see such cruelty, Chloe said softly. Maya used her corporate privilege to attack a pillar of the Black community. We are asking for your prayers, and we are asking for your support as we fight these baseless, malicious legal attacks. The sheer audacity of her statement was breathtaking. Chloe, a woman born into generational wealth, was actually on a live broadcast accusing a self-made Black woman of using corporate privilege to oppress a family of millionaire preachers. It was psychological warfare at its finest. And unfortunately, it was working. The live comments section on the side of the screen was moving so incredibly fast, it was just a blur of angry text. But the overall sentiment was crystal clear. The African American community in Atlanta is incredibly tight-knit, especially within the powerful circles of churchgoers and local entrepreneurs. The narrative that a cold, calculating tech CEO had intentionally destroyed a prominent Black family for her own financial gain struck a massive nerve. People were absolutely furious. The digital backlash was instantaneous and brutal. They called me a traitor to my own people. They called me a gold digger who had used the church prestige to build my business only to stab my husband in the back the moment I got rich. Prominent community leaders and local influencers who did not know the truth were already tweeting about boycotting my firm. Hashtags demanding my resignation were beginning to trend locally. The congregation was vowing to protest outside my corporate headquarters. My personal phone began to buzz relentlessly on the desk. It was my board of directors undoubtedly panicking over the sudden public relations nightmare unfolding on social media. They were watching the exact same broadcast, seeing our company name dragged through the mud by one of the most influential religious leaders in the state. I ignored the phone. I did not flinch. I did not feel a single ounce of anxiety or fear. I just sat there in my quiet, climate-controlled office, watching Terrence wipe his fake tears while his father asked the congregation to dig deep and donate to a special legal defense fund to fight my supposed tyranny. They were giving me exactly what I wanted. I needed them to feel completely invincible. I needed them to gather the absolute largest audience possible. Because the higher the pedestal they built for themselves, the more devastating the fall was going to be. The heavy glass door of my office opened quietly. My executive assistant, a sharp, incredibly efficient young woman named Elena, stepped into the room. She was holding a sleek silver tablet tightly against her chest. She walked briskly over to my mahogany desk and set the device down right next to my coffee cup. She did not look panicked by the ringing phones or the media storm outside. She knew exactly who she worked for. The broadcast has just peaked at 85,000 concurrent viewers across all platforms. Maya Elena said, her voice strictly professional, but carrying an undeniable undertone of anticipation. Every major local news outlet has picked up the live stream. They have the entire city watching them right now. I finally pulled my eyes away from Terrence's pathetic face on my iPad and looked up at Elena. And what about the IT department? Elena offered a sharp, dangerous smile. Marcus just sent the encrypted signal from the basement server room. He has successfully bypassed the central audiovisual firewall at the sanctuary. The church soundboard operators are completely locked out of the system. We have absolute unrestricted remote control over the massive projector screens hanging directly behind the pulpit. I leaned back in my leather chair and took one final sip of my vanilla latte. I set the cup down, placed my fingers on the smooth surface of the desk, and took a deep breath. "Tell Marcus to deploy the package," I said softly. I leaned forward, resting my fingers lightly over the keyboard. I watched the live broadcast on my tablet for one more agonizing second, letting Terrence soak in the absolute adoration of his deceived audience. Then, with a faint, ice-cold smile, I pressed the enter key on my laptop. A small green progress bar flashed across my monitor, hitting 100% almost instantly. The encrypted payload was successfully delivered. Back inside the massive sanctuary, Terrence was delivering the performance of his life. He gripped the edges of the wooden podium, bowing his head, as if the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. "We will rebuild," he preached, his voice trembling with perfectly calibrated emotion. "The devil thought he could break this family. He thought he could use a wicked woman to steal our joy and our home. But your prayers are our shield. God will restore what was taken from us." The crowd murmured in passionate agreement. Loud amens and shouts of support echoed through the cavernous room. Elderly women in the front rows were weeping, raising their hands in solidarity. Terrence looked up, soaking in the validation, completely unaware of the digital execution about to take place right behind him. Suddenly, the massive high-definition LED screens flanking the pulpit flickered violently. The soft, glowing image of the church logo vanished. For a split second, the screens went completely black. Then a glaring, bright white document materialized. Because the church broadcasting team was locked out of their own sound booth, the automated camera system simply adjusted to the new lighting and broadcast the giant screens directly to the live stream. 85,000 people watching from home and thousands sitting in the pews were suddenly staring at Terrence's private offshore banking ledger. A confused hush fell over the sanctuary. Pastor James turned around in his velvet chair, his face instantly draining of all color. He saw the official letterhead of a notorious Cayman Islands bank. He saw his own son name at the top of the account. "Cut the feed," Pastor James barked into his lapel microphone, his voice echoing awkwardly across the room. "Cut the screens right now." But the screens did not go black. Instead, they transitioned to a highly magnified image of a wire transfer receipt. The text was so large that even the people sitting in the furthest balcony could read the numbers clearly. It showed a direct transfer of $250,000. The origin account was clearly labeled as the Church Expansion and Orphanage Fund. The destination account was Terrence's offshore ledger. The silence in the room morphed into a dangerous, rumbling whisper. Thousands of people were collectively processing the fact that their hard-earned tithes had not gone to charity. Before Terrence could even formulate a lie, the screen shifted again. This time it displayed a long thread of text messages between Terrence and Sasha, his young pregnant mistress. The dates on the messages proved they had been sent months ago. "Do not worry about the price tag on the stroller baby," Terrence's message read in massive black font. "I am managing the building fund this month. These idiot sheep will just donate more on Sunday anyway. They love giving me their money. Go buy the Chanel bag too." The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The murmurs turned into outright screams of fury. The same women who had just been crying tears of sympathy were now standing on the church pews, pointing furiously at the stage. A man in the third row shouted a curse word that had likely never been spoken inside those holy walls. Terrence stepped back from the podium, his hands shaking wildly. "No, this is a lie," he yelled into the microphone, his voice cracking with absolute panic. "This is a cyber attack. My wife is framing me. Do not look at the screens." But the presentation was ruthless. It did not give him a single second to breathe. The text messages faded away, replaced by crisp security camera footage from an underground downtown betting club. The video filled the giant screens, and the audio was pumped directly through the church state of the Art Surround sound system. There was Terrence wearing a flashy designer suit, holding a thick stack of cash, and laughing hysterically with a known local bookie. His recorded voice boomed through the sanctuary speakers, drowning out his live protests. "My dad congregation is full of gullible fools," the recorded Terrence laughed, tossing a $100 bill onto the betting table. "I just tell them God wants them to plant a financial seed and they hand over their entire paychecks. It is the easiest hustle in the world. I just bought a sports car with the youth ministry budget and nobody even noticed." The moral facade did not just crack, it completely shattered into a million irreversible pieces. The betrayal was so deep, so disgustingly arrogant, that the congregation completely lost their minds. An elderly deacon in the front row, a man who had faithfully served Pastor James for 30 years, hurled his heavy leather study Bible directly at the pulpit. It smacked loudly against the wooden podium, shattering the glass of water Terence had been drinking from. That single action broke the dam. The crowd surged forward. Programs, hymnals, and water bottles rained down on the stage. The outrage was deafening. The people had been scammed, humiliated, and insulted by the very family they had trusted with their souls and their finances. Pastor James and First Lady Brenda did not attempt to calm the storm. They did not drop to their knees to pray for their congregation. Their survival instinct completely overrode their religious personas. James grabbed his wife by the arm, nearly dragging her out of her velvet chair. The two esteemed spiritual leaders abandoned their flock entirely, sprinting off the back of the stage toward the private pastoral exit like common criminals fleeing a robbery. Chloe was right behind them. She took one look at the furious, surging mob, realized her pristine reputation was going up in flames, and completely abandoned her loyal sister-in-law act. She violently kicked off her designer high heels, hiked up her expensive skirt, and ran barefoot for the side doors, leaving Terence completely alone to face the wrath of the people he had robbed. Terence was frozen in sheer terror, staring at the giant screen, displaying his own laughing face. A crumpled church program hit him square in the forehead. The reality of the mob finally snapped him out of his paralysis. He scrambled backward, his leather shoes slipping on the spilled water from the broken glass. He tripped over the microphone cord, falling hard onto his hands and knees. He did not even bother to stand up. He practically crawled off the back of the stage, pushing frantically through the heavy velvet curtains, just as a group of furious church members managed to climb onto the platform. The deafening screams of the betrayed congregation echoed behind him, a terrifying soundtrack to his absolute destruction. He sprinted down the long carpeted hallway of the church administrative wing. He blew past the financial offices he had looted, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it was going to crack his ribs. He did not stop running until he reached the executive pastoral restroom at the very end of the corridor. He shoved the heavy wooden door open, threw himself inside, and slammed it shut behind him. His shaking fingers fumbled with the deadbolt, finally sliding it into place with a sharp click. He backed away from the door, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He looked at himself in the wide vanity mirror. His expensive suit was torn at the shoulder. He was sweating profusely, and his eyes were wide with the crazed realization that his entire life was over. His family empire was burning to the ground on live television. His father was likely going to federal prison. His mistress was gone. His home was gone. He was universally hated by the entire city of Atlanta. But his massive delusional ego clung to one final desperate thread of hope. He still had his high-paying executive job at the investment bank. He still had his corporate title. If he could just hold on to his career, he could hire a crisis management team. He could rebuild. He could survive this. With violently shaking hands, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. He ignored the hundreds of hateful text messages flooding his screen from church members who had his personal number. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead, took a deep breath to steady his voice, and desperately dialed his boss' private number. The line rang twice before a sharp click signaled the connection. Terence pressed the phone so hard against his ear that his knuckles ached. He was breathing in ragged, shallow gasps, staring at his own terrified reflection in the vanity mirror of the church restroom. The heavy wooden door behind him vibrated slightly as the muffled, furious screams of the betrayed congregation echoed down the administrative hallway. He needed a lifeline. He needed his corporate identity to shield him from the total collapse of his personal life. Mr. Caldwell, Terence said, forcing his voice to adopt the smooth, confident cadence he used in boardrooms. "Listen to me, sir. I know what is happening on the news right now. I know the church broadcast is trending, but you have to understand this is a targeted cyber attack. My vindictive ex-wife hired hackers to fabricate bank statements and deepfake videos. It is a massive extortion attempt. I am already in contact with federal authorities to have the whole thing shut down." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Terrence squeezed his eyes shut, a drop of cold sweat rolling down his temple. He prayed that his boss, a ruthless and pragmatic investment banker, would care more about protecting the firm's assets than whatever moral scandal was playing out on social media. Terrence Mr. Caldwell finally spoke. His voice was entirely devoid of warmth. It was the icy, mechanical tone of an executive who had already made his decision and was simply delivering the paperwork. "I am going to stop you right there before you embarrass yourself any further. Sir, please, you cannot let a viral social media stunt dictate our business." Terrence pleaded, his professional facade cracking instantly. "I am your top vice president. I closed the commercial real estate portfolio last quarter. You know me, you know my family. We are pillars of this community. This will all blow over by tomorrow morning. I just need a few days of administrative leave to let my crisis management team handle the press." "Your corporate access badge was deactivated exactly 14 minutes ago," Mr. Caldwell said, completely ignoring Terrence's desperate pitch. "Your company laptop has been remotely wiped by our IT department. Security is currently boxing up the contents of your desk, and those boxes will be left by the loading dock. You are terminated with cause effective immediately." Terrence felt the blood drain entirely from his face. His legs suddenly felt like lead. What he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "You cannot do that. I have a contract. I have stock options. You are firing me over a fake internet video. You are letting a mob of angry church people dictate your corporate decisions. This is wrongful termination. I will sue the bank. I will sue you personally." Miles away, in the serene, climate-controlled environment of Apex Financial Holdings, I sat perfectly still behind my mahogany desk. If there had been a camera in the room, it would have slowly dollied out, pulling back to reveal the sheer magnitude of the empire I had built. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows framed the sprawling Atlanta skyline, a silent testament to the power and influence I commanded. The contrast was absolute. Terrence was currently cowering in a sweaty, filthy public restroom, listening to an angry mob tear apart his father's church. I was sitting in a custom leather chair, drinking a vanilla latte, watching the global stock tickers flash bright green across my monitors. I did not just orchestrate a public humiliation for Terrence. That was merely the entertainment. The real punishment was the systematic, total eradication of his financial independence. Over the past 7 days, while Terrence and his parents were busy crying to their congregation and setting up legal defense funds, I was holding closed-door meetings with the board of directors at Terrence's parent company. They were a mid-sized regional bank struggling with liquidity issues. Apex Financial Holdings had the capital to swallow them whole. It was a swift, aggressive, and entirely confidential corporate raid. Back in the church restroom, Terrence was still screaming into his phone, making empty legal threats and demanding to speak to human resources. "Are you quite finished?" Mr. Caldwell asked sharply, cutting through Terrence's hysterical rant. "Because you seem to be operating under a massive delusion. I am not firing you because of a viral video. I am not firing you because I care about the public relations nightmare your family has created. And I am certainly not firing you because of social media." Then why? Terrence yelled, tears of sheer frustration spilling over his eyelashes. "I made this bank millions of dollars. You are the chief executive officer. You answer to no one. Why are you throwing me to the wolves?" "I am not the chief executive officer anymore, Terrence, Mr. Caldwell replied, his voice dropping into a low, deadly register. "The ink on the merger documents dried at exactly 9 o'clock this morning. Our bank was completely acquired by Apex Financial Holdings. We are now a wholly owned subsidiary. Which means I do have a boss. Your ex-wife is the new chairman of our board of directors." Terrence stopped breathing. The air in his lungs turned to absolute ice. The muffled sounds of the riot outside the bathroom door faded away, replaced by a high-pitched, deafening ringing in his ears. And her very first executive order as chairman, Mr. Caldwell, continued twisting the knife with professional precision, was to personally review your client portfolios. Our internal auditors have already found the discrepancies. The money you skimmed from your own clients to cover your underground betting losses. We are handing the files over to the federal investigators by noon. You are not just fired, Terrence. You are going to federal prison. Do not ever call this number again. The line went dead. Terrence stared blankly at the dark screen of his cell phone. His hands were shaking so violently that the device slipped through his fingers. It hit the hard ceramic tile floor with a sharp crack, the screen shattering into a spiderweb of broken glass. His knees buckled completely. He slid slowly down the cold tiled wall of the restroom, leaving a damp streak of sweat against the paint. He collapsed onto the floor, pulling his knees up to his chest like a frightened child. Every single escape route he had ever possessed was permanently sealed. His father's church was destroyed, its accounts frozen by the FBI. His pregnant mistress had abandoned him the moment she realized he was broke. His luxury penthouse belonged to me. And now the corporate career he used to mask his absolute incompetence was gone, replaced by looming federal indictments. The religious facade, the corporate privilege, the arrogant swagger, it had all been systematically dismantled and burned to ash. He had absolutely nothing left. He sat there in the silence of the bathroom stall, tears streaming freely down his face, the reality of his total destruction finally settling over him like a heavy, suffocating blanket. He thought he could outsmart me. He thought my quiet demeanor meant I was weak. He did not realize that while he was playing checkers, I had bought the entire board. Suddenly, the brass handle of the restroom door jiggled violently. Terrence flinched, snapping his head up. He expected to see a mob of furious church deacons kicking the door in to drag him out into the sanctuary. But the door pushed open slowly, revealing a single disheveled figure. It was Chloe. She looked entirely unhinged. Her expensive, tailored designer dress was torn at the hem. She had lost her shoes somewhere in her frantic sprint away from the angry congregation, and her bare feet were covered in dirt and scuff marks. Her perfectly styled blonde hair was a tangled wild mess, and dark streaks of expensive mascara stained her cheeks like war paint. But her eyes were not fearful. They were absolutely lethal. Chloe had spent her entire life carefully curating an image of wealthy, progressive perfection. She had married into a prominent family to elevate her own social standing, happily playing the role of the benevolent, privileged ally. She had looked down on me for years, treating me like a charity case who should be grateful just to sit at their dinner table. And now her husband had publicly humiliated her, fathering a child with a broke mistress, using stolen church funds. Her pristine reputation was collateral damage in the explosion I had caused, and she was furious enough to kill. She stepped into the restroom, the heavy wooden door swinging shut behind her. She looked down at Terrence, who was still huddled pathetically on the floor. She did not offer him a hand. She did not show a single ounce of familial sympathy. She looked at him with the same absolute disgust one might reserve for a squashed insect on the bottom of a shoe. She reached into the pocket of her torn dress and pulled out a thick, heavily folded stack of legal documents. She threw them violently at Terrence's face. The heavy packet struck his cheek and landed on the floor next to his shattered phone. "Sign them," Chloe hissed, her voice trembling with an explosive, venomous rage that echoed off the tiled walls. 3 days after the spectacular collapse of Pastor James' religious empire, the atmosphere inside my corner office was a picture of absolute undisturbed tranquility. The camera would glide smoothly across the polished surface of my mahogany desk, panning past the framed photographs of my early startup days, moving past the sleek silver pen holder, and stopping deliberately on a crisp white document. The paper bore a bold red stamp that read, "Outstanding Debt Notice." I was reviewing the quarterly projections for my newly acquired banking subsidiary when the intercom on my desk buzzed. It was Elena, my executive assistant, and her voice carried a rare tone of mild amusement. "Maya, I have a visitor at the front reception for you. She does not have an appointment, and frankly, security was about to escort her out, but she is practically begging to speak with you. It is Chloe." I leaned back in my leather chair, letting the silence stretch for a moment. Send her in, Elena, and make sure security stays close by just in case she forgets her manners. A minute later, the heavy glass door to my office opened. I almost did not recognize the woman who stepped over the threshold. The Chloe I knew was a walking billboard for generational wealth. She usually radiated an effortless, arrogant perfection wrapped in designer silk and dripping in family money. The woman standing before me looked like a ghost of that persona. Her blonde hair, usually styled in flawless, bouncy waves, was pulled back into a severe, messy knot. She was wearing a plain beige trench coat over a simple black dress, and her face was entirely devoid of makeup, revealing dark, heavy bags under her eyes. The supreme confidence, the condescending smirk she always wore when she looked at me, was completely gone. She clutched her leather handbag so tightly her knuckles were white, and she looked around my expansive sunlit office with a mixture of awe and deep, festering envy. "Have a seat, Chloe," I said, gesturing to one of the modern leather chairs opposite my desk. I kept my voice perfectly level, offering neither warmth nor hostility. She walked forward hesitantly and sank into the chair as if her legs could barely support her weight. For a long moment, she just stared at her hands. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the city traffic far below the glass windows. I gave him the papers. She finally whispered, her voice rough and exhausted. "I cornered Darren that night and forced him to sign the divorce decree. I told my lawyers to take him for absolutely everything. I wanted half of his savings, the cars, the house, his entire investment portfolio. I wanted to leave him with absolutely nothing for humiliating me with that pregnant girl." I picked up my coffee cup, taking a slow sip. "And what did your highly paid lawyers discover?" Chloe let out a sound that was caught somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "They discovered that Darren does not exist financially. He has absolutely nothing, Maya. Nothing. The Mercedes he drove, the luxury townhouse we lived in, his massive salary at the bank. It was all a giant illusion. Everything he touched was legally owned by the Church Pastoral Trust Fund. His salary was officially classified as a religious housing stipend. My lawyers pulled the records and realized Darren does not even have a personal savings account in his own name. And because Terrence decided to use that exact same church trust fund to launder money and hide his gambling debts, the federal government stepped in." I finished the thought for her, setting my cup down. Chloe nodded, a single tear spilling over her lashes. "The FBI froze everything. They seized the townhouse. They impounded the cars. Even the joint checking account I use for my daily expenses is locked down under federal investigation. I went to the ATM yesterday and my card was declined for a $20 coffee." I watched her cry, feeling absolutely nothing. "What about your father?" I asked calmly. "Richard Sterling is a very wealthy real estate developer. Surely he can write his favorite daughter a check to tide her over." Chloe's face twisted in pure anguish. "My father cut me off. The moment the news broke about the money laundering, the moment Pastor James' name was dragged through the federal mud, my father panicked. His real estate firm relies on clean public relations. He told me I was a liability for marrying into a criminal family and bringing a federal scandal to his doorstep. He froze my trust fund. He told me I am on my own until the divorce is finalized and my name is cleared of any federal charges. Maya, I have nothing. I am completely broke." She leaned forward, placing her hands flat on the edge of my mahogany desk. Her eyes were wide, pleading with a desperate intensity. She was about to play a card I knew all too well, the ultimate weapon of a privileged woman who suddenly finds herself backed into a corner. "Woman to woman, Maya, you have to help me," Chloe begged, her voice trembling with manufactured sincerity. "We are both victims here. We were both lied to by these terrible, corrupt brothers. They used us. They manipulated us. We need to stick together. I just need a loan, just a small personal loan from your firm to keep my luxury apartment and pay the retainer for my divorce attorney. I swear I will pay you back with interest the second my father unlocks my trust fund. You have millions. You own a bank now. A $50,000 loan is nothing to you, but it would save my life. Please, Maya. woman to woman. I sat perfectly still. I let her desperate words hang in the air, allowing the sheer audacity of her request to settle over the room. She was actually sitting in my office begging for my money and trying to invoke some kind of imaginary sisterhood. I slowly folded my hands together and rested them on the desk. Woman to woman, I repeated, testing the phrase on my tongue. The words sounded completely hollow. I looked directly into her tear-filled eyes. Do you remember the country club charity gala 3 years ago, Chloe? She blinked clearly, thrown off by the sudden shift in the conversation. What? I do not understand what that has to do with anything. I remember it vividly. I continued, my voice dropping to a low, chilling register. Terrence insisted we attend because your father bought a premium table. I was in the middle of launching my first software prototype. I was pouring every single dollar I had into my business. I could not afford a new designer gown, so I wore a simple older black dress I had bought off the rack years before. Chloe swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously toward the door. You walked up to me in front of the entire congregation, in front of the city's most elite investors, and you looked me up and down like I was a piece of trash that had blown in from the street. I recounted the memory with perfect lethal clarity. You laughed loudly and asked me if I needed you to point me toward the charity donation bin. You told everyone at the table that Terrence was so generous for taking a charity case as a wife. You humiliated me to elevate yourself. You never saw me as a woman, Chloe. You never saw me as an equal. You saw me as a prop, a dark, poor contrast to your bright, wealthy perfection. Maya. I was just joking, Chloe stammered, shrinking back into her chair. It was just a stupid comment. I did not mean anything by it. You meant exactly what you said, I replied sharply, cutting off her excuses. You loved watching me shrink. You loved the power dynamic. So do not come into my office now when your fraudulent kingdom has collapsed and try to play the victim card. We are not sisters. We are not allies. You enabled their toxic behavior for years because it benefited you. You are only crying now because the fire finally reached your side of the house. Chloe's face hardened. The desperate pleading facade dropped instantly, replaced by a flash of the old entitled arrogance. So that is it, she snapped, sitting up straighter. You are just going to sit there on your high horse and watch me lose my apartment over a petty grudge about a dress. You really are as cold and bitter as Terrence said you were. I am not cold, I said, offering her a brilliant, terrifying smile. I am just a very meticulous businesswoman. Which brings me to the real reason I allowed you into my office today. I reached across the desk, picked up the crisp white document with the bold red outstanding debt notice stamp, and slid it smoothly across the mahogany surface. It stopped right at the edge of the desk, perfectly aligned in front of her. Chloe looked down at the paper, her brow furrowing in confusion. What is this? That is an invoice, I explained calmly. When my financial firm acquired the massive debt Terrence owed on the penthouse, we also absorbed the associated administrative, legal, and penalty fees he accumulated by defaulting on those loans. The total came out to exactly $50,000. Chloe scoffed, pushing the paper back toward me. That is Terrence's problem. I have nothing to do with his mortgages. Go send this to him in his jail cell. I tapped my perfectly manicured fingernail against the top of the document. You should really read the fine print before you speak, Chloe. Terrence did not just forge my name on those loans. He used the family business as collateral. And unfortunately for you, Darren is listed as a co-guarantor on the Master Family Trust. Since you are still legally married to Darren, and since you eagerly signed those joint tax returns every single year without reading them, you are legally liable for the debts incurred by the trust. Chloe's face went completely slack. The remaining color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking physically ill. She stared at the numbers on the page as if they were written in a foreign language. You came in here asking for a $50,000 loan, I said, my voice ringing with finality. But you are leaving here with a $50,000 debt. My corporate collection department is extremely aggressive. If this invoice is not paid in full within 30 days, we will place a lien on whatever assets you manage to scrape together in your divorce. We will garnish your future wages. We will destroy whatever is left of your precious credit score. You cannot do this to me, Chloe whispered, her voice cracking in pure terror. I cannot pay this. I do not have a job. I have never had a real job. How am I supposed to pay you $50,000? I leaned back in my chair, turning my attention back to my computer monitor to signal that the meeting was officially over. I suggest you start looking for employment, Chloe. I hear the local coffee shops are hiring. Maybe they will let you wear an older dress to your interview. Chloe sat there for a few seconds, completely paralyzed by the reality of her new life. She had walked into my office hoping to use her privilege one last time. Instead, I had handed her the bill for her own arrogance. She slowly stood up, her hands shaking as she grabbed the debt notice off the desk. She did not say another word. She turned around and walked out of my office, her heavy, defeated footsteps echoing quietly against the glass walls. I watched the door click shut behind her. The woman who had spent her entire life looking down on everyone else was finally forced to look up from the absolute bottom. The camera would follow me in a smooth, continuous tracking shot, moving steadily behind my shoulder as I walked through the heavy double doors of the sanctuary. The massive, cavernous space that once held thousands of cheering, devoted followers was now completely silent. The vibrant stained glass windows, which usually bathed the pews in warm, colorful light, looked dull and lifeless under the overcast Atlanta sky. There were no ushers in sharp suits. There was no choir practicing in the loft. There were only bright orange foreclosure notices taped to the glass, and the echoing hollow sound of my heels clicking against the polished marble floor. I walked straight down the center aisle, bypassing the massive wooden pulpit, where Terrence had publicly humiliated himself just days earlier. I headed directly for the executive pastoral suite tucked away behind the main stage. The heavy oak door was propped open with a heavy bronze cross. Inside the lavishly decorated office, the absolute dismantling of a religious empire was quietly taking place. Pastor James and First Lady Brenda were surrounded by a sea of brown cardboard boxes. The luxurious custom-made pastoral robes were stuffed haphazardly into plastic garbage bags. James was standing on a small stepladder, bitterly pulling down his numerous framed awards, honorary degrees, and photographs with prominent politicians. Brenda was kneeling on the floor, frantically wrapping her expensive crystal vases in old newspaper. They looked completely exhausted, stripped of the divine, untouchable aura they had projected for decades. I stopped in the doorway and simply watched them for a moment. They had not noticed my arrival. They were too busy mourning the loss of their material wealth. "Do you need help packing the collection plates?" I asked, my voice cutting through the quiet rustle of packing tape. Or did the federal investigators already confiscate those as evidence? James nearly fell off his stepladder. He spun around, clutching a heavy gold-framed plaque to his chest. His face immediately contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. Brenda gasped, dropping a crystal vase back into its box and scrambling to her feet. "What are you doing here?" James demanded, his booming preacher voice echoing awkwardly in the half-empty room. "You have no right to be in this building. The bank gave us until midnight to vacate the premises. Get out of my office before I call the police for trespassing." I leaned against the heavy oak doorframe, crossing my arms over my chest. "The police are already quite familiar with your family, James. I do not think you want to invite them back. Besides, I am not trespassing. The federal receivership officially liquidated this property this morning. I am just here to inspect the grounds before the new contractors arrive." James puffed out his chest, desperately trying to summon the commanding, authoritative presence he used to intimidate his congregation. He stepped down from the ladder, walking toward me with a furious glare. He refused to accept that his spiritual authority meant absolutely nothing to me. "You think you have won, Maya," he sneered, pointing a thick finger at my face. "You think because you have money and corporate lawyers that you can destroy God's anointed and walk away unpunished. You are a wicked, vindictive woman. You are a Jezebel trying to tear down a holy sanctuary. But the Lord is my shepherd. No weapon formed against me shall prosper. God will rain fire down upon your life for what you have done to this family. You will suffer for touching his anointed." He was practically spitting the words at me, wrapping his own corrupt, negligent behavior in the protective cloak of the Bible. It was the exact same manipulation tactic he had used on me for 5 years whenever I questioned Terrence's financial irresponsibility or Brenda's cruel remarks. He always used scripture to demand absolute submission. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step back. I looked at him with an expression of pure, icy pity. "You are not anointed, James," I said, my voice dangerously soft but carrying an undeniable weight. "You are just unemployed, and you are a fraud. Do not stand there and quote scripture to me as if you did not look the other way while your son stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from the single mothers and elderly widows in your congregation. You knew he was funneling money out of the building fund. You knew he was living beyond his means. But you let him do it because he was your golden child and keeping up appearances was more important to you than your own integrity." I took a slow, deliberate step into the office, forcing James to take a step back. "You want to quote the Bible, James?" I asked, locking my eyes directly onto his. "Let us quote the Bible. Galatians chapter 6 verse 7. Do not be deceived, God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows." The color drained entirely from James's face. "You did not reap a spiritual attack," I continued, my voice sharp and relentless. "You reaped the consequences of raising an arrogant, entitled thief. You reaped the consequences of your own greed. I am not a weapon formed against you. I am just the mirror reflecting exactly what you built. A house of lies. And now it has burned to the ground." James opened his mouth to argue, to offer another booming theological excuse, but the words died in his throat. The sheer, undeniable truth of his failure hit him like a physical blow. His shoulders slumped. The heavy gold plaque slipped from his hands and clattered onto the carpeted floor. His massive ego, the shield he had used to protect himself from accountability, his entire life completely shattered. He turned away from me, covering his face with his hands, a broken, defeated old man. Brenda, who had been watching the exchange in stunned silence, suddenly broke. The reality of her husband's defeat, combined with the sight of her worldly possessions packed into cheap cardboard boxes, pushed her over the edge. She had spent her entire adult life as the revered First Lady of the church. She was used to sitting in velvet chairs, wearing expensive hats, and being treated like royalty wherever she went in Atlanta. The thought of losing her status, of becoming a public disgrace, was a fate worse than death. She suddenly rushed forward. Before I could even react, Brenda dropped heavily onto her knees right in front of me. "Maya, please." Brenda sobbed, her hands desperately grabbing the hem of my designer trench coat. "Please, I am begging you. Have mercy on us. We have lost Terrence. We have lost our home. We are going to lose everything." I looked down at the woman who had spent years telling me I was uncultured, ungrateful, and unworthy of her son. I looked at the woman who had eagerly welcomed Terrence's pregnant mistress into my home just a week prior. "You own the bank now," Brenda cried, tears streaming down her carefully applied makeup. "You have the millions. You can stop this. Please, Maya, buy the church. Pay off the federal liens. Let us keep the sanctuary. We will sign whatever you want. We will publicly apologize to you on Sunday morning. Just do not let them take our church away. I cannot live in the shadows. I cannot be a nobody. Please, woman to woman, daughter to mother, save us." I gently but firmly pulled the hem of my coat out of her desperate grip. I reached into my leather handbag and pulled out a crisp, heavy piece of paper bearing the official seal of the city of Atlanta. I looked down at Brenda, who was staring up at me with wide, desperately hopeful eyes. She actually believed her tears could erase years of emotional abuse. She actually believed I would use my hard-earned capital to save the very institution they had used to oppress me. "I did buy the deed from the federal receivership, Brenda," I said smoothly. "The transaction cleared 2 hours ago. Apex Financial Holdings now officially owns this entire property, the sanctuary, the administrative buildings, and the massive parking lot. Brenda let out a breathless, joyful gasp. She reached for my hands, her face lighting up with absolute relief. "Oh, thank you, Maya. Thank you. I knew you had a good heart. I knew you would not abandon family." I pulled my hands away before she could touch me. I unfolded the heavy piece of paper and dropped it onto the floor, right in front of her knees. "I am not saving your church, Brenda," I said, my voice stripping away every last ounce of her hope. "That is an approved city zoning and demolition notice. I am having the bulldozers come in next Monday morning. This entire sanctuary is going to be leveled to the dirt." Brenda froze, her joyful smile morphing instantly into a mask of pure horror. What she whispered, her eyes darting frantically from the paper to my face. "No, you cannot tear down the house of God." "It is not the house of God anymore," I replied coldly. "It is prime commercial real estate. Once the demolition is complete, my firm is breaking ground on a brand new state-of-the-art facility. We are building a massive financial incubator and support center exclusively for minority women entrepreneurs. We are going to provide grants, legal protection, and business education to women who need to build their own independence. Women who need to escape toxic, controlling environments run by men exactly like your husband and your son." I looked at James, who was staring at me in absolute devastated silence, and then back down to Brenda, who was weeping uncontrollably on the floor. "I am replacing your monument to hypocrisy with something that will actually serve this community," I said, turning on my heel toward the door. "You have until midnight to finish packing your boxes. Make sure you are gone before the wrecking balls arrive." I knew exactly where Terrence would go. When a parasite violently loses its primary host, it immediately scrambles to find another. If this were a film, the camera capturing his descent would be tilted in a harsh, disorienting Dutch angle, perfectly reflecting his severely unbalanced and desperate reality. His world was completely off its axis. He had spent the last few hours wandering the city streets. His custom-tailored suit, once a symbol of his arrogant corporate pride, was now wrinkled, stained with sweat, and reeked of the jail cell he had just bailed himself out of. His luxury vehicle was securely parked in my private garage, heavily guarded by my corporate security team. His credit cards were declining. His bank accounts were seized. He had absolutely nowhere else to turn. So he walked 2 miles in his expensive leather shoes to a modest gated apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. It was the apartment he had secretly rented for Sasha. He figured that since he had paid the security deposit and the first 6 months of rent using stolen church funds, he was entitled to sleep on her couch. He assumed he could use his silver tongue to manipulate her. He thought he could convince her that this was just a temporary setback, a minor misunderstanding that his high-priced lawyers would clear up in a matter of days. He dragged his exhausted feet up the 3 flights of concrete stairs to her floor. He did not bother to knock gently. He pounded his fist against the cheap wooden door, leaning his heavy, defeated frame against the door jamb. "Sasha, open up." "It is Terrence," he called out, his voice a pathetic, raspy whisper. "I need to come in. We need to talk about our living arrangements." He heard the deadbolt slide back. The door swung open, but the person standing on the other side of the threshold was not his pregnant mistress. It was Darren. Terrence blinked, his exhausted brain struggling to process the sight of his younger brother standing in Sasha's living room. Darren looked just as completely destroyed as Terrence did. Darren was wearing the exact same clothes he had worn during the catastrophic dinner party at my penthouse. He had a dark purple bruise forming on his cheek where Chloe had viciously slapped him, and he was holding a cheap plastic cup filled with cheap liquor. "What the hell are you doing here?" Terrence demanded, a sudden surge of territorial rage overriding his exhaustion. "Get out of my apartment. I pay the rent here." Darren let out a harsh, humorless laugh. He leaned against the doorframe, completely blocking his older brother from stepping inside. "You do not pay the rent here anymore, Terrence. You do not pay for anything. I saw the news. I saw the live stream of the sanctuary. You are completely broke. And more importantly, she is carrying my child." I am the father. I belong here. Terence shoved his hands violently against Darren's chest, forcing his brother backward into the small entryway. I am the older brother. I am the vice president of the bank. You are nothing but a spoiled child living off your wife's trust fund. And since Chloe just threw you out on the street, you have absolutely nothing to offer her. I have nothing because of you. Darren screamed, slapping Terrence's hands away and shoving him right back. You stole the church money. You triggered the federal investigation. My entire life is frozen because you could not stop placing bets on underground basketball games. You ruined our family. You ruined my marriage. You ruined your own marriage the second you slept with my girl, Terrence roared back, his face twisting into an ugly mask of pure fury. The two brothers, the golden children of Pastor James and First Lady Brenda, the men who had been raised to believe they were morally superior to everyone else in Atlanta, completely abandoned whatever shred of dignity they had left. Terrence threw a sloppy, uncoordinated punch that clipped Darren on the jaw. Darren retaliated instantly, tackling his older brother through the open doorway and out into the public hallway. They crashed hard onto the cheap carpet, rolling around like wild dogs fighting over a scrap of meat. They threw punches, tore at each other's clothes, and screamed horrific, venomous insults that echoed loudly up and down the stairwell. Years of hidden sibling rivalry, jealousy, and toxic entitlement finally erupted into a pathetic, bloody brawl. Neighbors began opening their doors, pulling out their smartphones to record the two men destroying each other. I watched the entire scene unfold from the comfort of my home office through a secure live feed. I had hired a private investigator to keep an eye on Sasha's apartment the moment Terrence posted bail. The second my investigator reported that Darren had shown up and that Terrence was walking up the stairs, I picked up a burner phone and placed a very calm, anonymous call to the local police precinct to report a violent domestic disturbance. The sound of blaring police sirens cut through the humid night air just as Terrence managed to pin Darren to the floor. Before Terrence could throw another punch, 3 uniformed police officers rushed up the stairwell. "Break it up right now!" the lead officer shouted, pulling his taser from his belt. The officers grabbed the two brothers by their torn collars, dragging them violently apart. Terrence was bleeding from a cut above his eyebrow. Darren's shirt was ripped completely open, exposing his chest. They were both panting heavily, glaring at each other with absolute hatred, while the police shoved them face first against the hallway wall. At that exact moment, Sasha finally appeared in the doorway of her apartment. She was wearing a silk robe Terrence had bought for her, holding her pregnant belly, and looking at both of them with an expression of profound, unfiltered disgust. "Sasha, tell them I live here," Terrence pleaded, pressing his bruised cheek against the painted drywall, as an officer pulled his arms behind his back. "Tell them to let me inside." Darren struggled against the officer holding him. "Sasha, I am the father of your baby. Tell them to arrest him. He attacked me." Sasha looked at Terrence, then she looked at Darren. The sweet, innocent, confused girl act was completely gone. She crossed her arms over her chest and let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Are you both completely out of your minds?" Sasha snapped, her voice dripping with sheer contempt. "You are both broke. Neither of you have a car. Neither of you have a bank account. Terrence is going to federal prison, and Darren does not even know how to tie his own shoes without his rich wife helping him. I do not want either of you in my apartment. I am packing my bags and moving back to my mother's house in the morning." But the baby Darren whined, his voice cracking. "I will send you a bill for child support the second the kid is born." Sasha fired back ruthlessly. "But seeing as how the federal government just seized all your assets, I am guessing I will be paying for these diapers myself. Do not ever come near my door again. You are both pathetic losers." She stepped back inside, grabbed the door handle, and slammed the heavy wooden door shut with a deafening crack. The loud click of the deadbolt sliding into place sounded like a final judgment. The police officers did not waste any time. They roughly clicked the metal handcuffs around both of their wrists. "You have the right to remain silent," the lead officer recited in a bored, monotone voice. "You are both being placed under arrest for public affray, disorderly conduct, and disturbing the peace. Let us go." They marched the two bruised, bleeding brothers down the concrete stairs and out into the damp parking lot. The flashing lights of the police cruisers illuminated the small crowd of neighbors who had gathered to watch the spectacle. Terrence kept his head down, the shame finally crushing the last remaining breath of his ego. As the officer pushed Terrence toward the back door of the cruiser, a man in a plain gray suit stepped out from the shadows of the parking lot. He walked briskly past the yellow police tape, holding up a badge to identify himself to the arresting officers. "Excuse me, officers," the man said smoothly. "I just need a moment with this one before you take him in for booking." The officer paused, keeping a firm grip on Terrence's arm. The man in the suit stopped directly in front of Terrence. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope sealed with red tape. "Terrence Vance." The man asked, his voice strictly professional. Terrence slowly raised his head, his eyes widening in confusion. "Yes, that is me." The man slapped the heavy envelope directly against Terrence's chest. Terrence instinctively brought his handcuffed hands up to catch it before it fell. "You have been served," the man stated loudly, making sure his body camera recorded the interaction. "Those are official court summons from the federal prosecutor's office. You are being formally indicted on 3 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of embezzlement, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit money laundering. Your preliminary hearing is scheduled for next Tuesday at 9 in the morning. I suggest you retain legal counsel immediately. Have a good night." The process server turned on his heel and walked away, disappearing back into the shadows of the city. Terrence stood frozen next to the police car, clutching the thick envelope with trembling, bloody hands. The weight of the documents felt like an anvil. He needed a lawyer. He needed a top-tier, incredibly expensive criminal defense attorney just to keep himself out of a maximum security federal penitentiary. But as the police officer shoved his head down and forced him into the back seat of the cruiser, the terrifying, suffocating reality finally set in. He did not have $50,000 for a legal retainer. He did not have $50 to his name. The luxury life he had stolen was gone. The family that always bailed him out was destroyed. The wife he had relentlessly abused had completely dismantled his empire. He had absolutely no money for a lawyer. He was going to face the full wrath of the United States federal government entirely alone. The crushing weight of the federal indictment was the final nail in the coffin of Terrence's arrogance. A week after that humiliating night outside his mistress's apartment, the sky over Atlanta broke open, unleashing a torrential, freezing downpour. If a camera were capturing this moment, it would start with a static, wide shot of the massive, sleek glass exterior of Apex Financial Holdings. The building stood like an impenetrable fortress against the stormy night, radiating cold, untouchable power. Then the camera would execute a rapid, intense zoom straight into the drenched, pathetic face of the man standing on the sidewalk. Terrence was completely unrecognizable. The immaculate grooming, the expensive cologne, the arrogant swagger, it was all washed away by the relentless rain. He was wearing the same suit jacket from the night of his arrest, now permanently stained and clinging to his shivering frame. He had spent the last 7 days sleeping on a cot in a cheap motel room paid for by a pitying former church deacon. Every single defense attorney he called had demanded a minimum retainer of $100,000 just to review his federal case file. He had absolutely no one left to call. No one except the woman he had spent 5 years trying to destroy. The heavy steel gate of my corporate underground parking garage slowly rolled open. My driver Marcus guided my sleek black Bentley out into the storm, the headlights slicing through the heavy sheets of rain. I was sitting in the spacious back seat reviewing a digital contract on my tablet, completely detached from the miserable weather outside. Suddenly, Marcus slammed his foot on the brake pedal. The heavy luxury car jerked to a sudden halt, the anti-lock brakes grinding against the wet pavement. I looked up from my screen, frowning slightly. "What is it, Marcus?" "There is a man blocking the exit ramp." "Boss," Marcus said, his voice tight with immediate concern. He stepped right out in front of the grill. "I am calling building security right now." I leaned forward and looked through the rain-streaked windshield. Standing dead center in the middle of the driveway illuminated by the glaring LED headlights of my car, was Terrence. He held his hands up in the air, a universal gesture of surrender, while the freezing rain battered his face. He did not look angry. He looked entirely broken. "Cancel the call to security, Marcus," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "Unlock the doors." Marcus hesitated, glancing at me through the rearview mirror. "Are you sure, boss?" "He looks unstable." "I am perfectly sure. He is not a threat anymore. He is just a desperate man who has finally run out of options." I reached over and pressed the silver button on the door panel. The thick, tinted window rolled down smoothly, letting the cold, damp air and the loud drumming sound of the rain into the quiet, leather-lined cabin. Terrence immediately rushed to the side of the car. He did not try to open the door. He did not shout threats. Instead, he dropped straight down onto his knees on the wet concrete, ignoring the muddy water soaking into his ruined trousers. He gripped the edge of my window frame with shaking, desperate hands. "Maya, please," Terrence begged, his voice cracking and barely audible over the roaring storm. "Please, you have to talk to me. Just give me 5 minutes. That is all I am asking for." 5 minutes. I did not lean toward him. I stayed perfectly comfortably seated against the plush leather, looking down at him with an expression of absolute indifference. "You are blocking my car, Terrence. And you are getting water on my upholstery." He flinched as if I had struck him, but his grip on the window frame only tightened. "Maya, they are going to lock me away for 20 years, he sobbed, the rain washing the tears down his face in steady streams. "The federal prosecutors offered me a plea deal this morning, but I still have to serve at least 10 years in a maximum security prison. I cannot survive in there. You know I cannot survive that. You have the power to stop this. Your firm owns the bank now. You can drop the civil suits. You can refuse to cooperate with the FBI. You can tell them it was an accounting error. You can afford the best lawyers in the country. Just buy me a defense team. I will do whatever you want. I will sign whatever you put in front of me. I will be your servant for the rest of my life." I tilted my head slightly, studying his pathetic, trembling form. "You want me to commit perjury and obstruct a federal investigation to save the man who secretly mortgaged my home and used the money to buy designer bags for his mistress." "I made a mistake," Terrence wailed, his voice pitching upward in pure desperation. "I was stupid. I was arrogant. But Maya, please look at me. It is me. We were married. We shared a bed for 5 years. We built a life together. You loved me once. I know you did. Underneath all this anger, I know that love is still there. You are a good person. You are a forgiving person. Please remember the man you married. Remember the vows we took. For better or for worse. Do not let them take my life away." He was weaponizing the very vows he had broken 1,000 times over. He was trying to manipulate my empathy, assuming that because I was a woman, I would eventually soften. He thought he could reach into the past and extract some lingering emotional attachment to save himself from the absolute ruin of his own choices. I reached into the leather briefcase sitting on the seat next to me. I did not pull out a handkerchief for his tears. I did not pull out a checkbook. I pulled out a single perfectly dry piece of paper. "I loved the man I thought you were, Terrence," I said, my voice cutting through the noise of the storm like a shard of ice. "But that man never existed. You were just a parasite wearing a very expensive suit. I do not feel anger toward you anymore. I do not feel hatred. I feel absolutely nothing. You are a stranger who owes me a massive debt, and I always collect my debts." I held the piece of paper out the window, keeping it just out of his reach. "Do you know what this is?" I asked. Terrence stared at the paper, his eyes wide and uncomprehending. He shook his head slowly, the rain dripping from his chin. "It is the utility bill from the penthouse for the month of October," I stated flatly. "The water company broke down the exact cost of consumption per gallon. I had my accounting department run the numbers this morning. It was a very interesting calculation." Terrence stared at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. He was begging for his life, and I was talking about municipal utilities. I looked him dead in the eyes, ensuring every single word etched itself permanently into his shattered ego. The glass of ice water you threw in my face at the dinner table cost exactly 30 cents, Terrence, I said softly, yet the words hit him harder than a physical blow. You spent 30 cents to humiliate me. You spent 30 cents to make yourself feel like a king in front of your hypocritical family. I let go of the paper. It fluttered down, landing directly in the muddy puddle slowly forming around his knees. The rain immediately soaked into the paper, ruining the ink. But the penthouse you lost because of that glass of water cost $3 million? I continued, my voice entirely void of mercy. And the freedom you are about to lose cost everything else. Terrence let out a strangled, breathless gasp. He looked down at the ruined piece of paper floating in the dirty water, the absolute finality of my words finally breaking the last remaining piece of his spirit. He realized in that exact moment that there was no hidden reserve of love. There was no forgiveness. There was only the cold, hard mathematical reality of his own destruction. I pressed the silver button on the door panel. Enjoy prison, Terrence. The tinted glass window rolled up swiftly, sealing the cabin with a solid, definitive thud. The loud noise of the rain and Terrence's sudden agonizing scream were instantly muted, replaced by the soft, classical music playing on the car's sound system. Drive Marcus the First, instructed smoothly. The Bentley's massive engine purred to life. Marcus navigated the heavy car seamlessly around Terrence's kneeling form, accelerating smoothly onto the slick, rain-soaked city street. I did not look back. I did not need to see him crying in the mud. The past was officially closed. The debt was fully paid. The storm outside raged on, but inside my world everything was perfectly clear. 6 months passed since that rainy night outside my corporate headquarters. The justice system moves slowly, but when it is fueled by undeniable financial evidence and an angry mob of betrayed citizens, it moves with absolute crushing certainty. If this were a film, this is where the music would shift. The camera would take you through a smooth, deliberate montage showing exactly what happens when arrogant people finally run out of lies to tell. We would start in a sterile, fluorescent-lit federal courtroom. Terrence stood before a federal judge wearing a bright orange jumpsuit instead of his custom-tailored suits. Without the funds to hire a top-tier defense attorney, he had been forced to rely on an overworked public defender who told him from day one that his case was entirely hopeless. The judge did not care about his former title as a bank vice president. The judge did not care that his father used to be a prominent pastor. Terrence was sentenced to 5 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, followed by 10 years of strict supervised probation and an order to pay millions in restitution. When the bailiff clicked the heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists to lead him away, Terrence did not look around the courtroom for his family. He knew they were not there. He was completely abandoned. The man who once demanded I leave my own home within 30 seconds was now destined to spend the next half-decade in a tiny concrete cell where his massive ego would rot away into absolutely nothing. He would eat bland cafeteria food, sleep on a thin mattress, and follow orders from armed guards. His corporate identity was erased, replaced entirely by a federal inmate number. The camera would then glide seamlessly across town, far away from the affluent neighborhoods of Atlanta, to a sprawling, run-down social housing complex. Inside a cramped, poorly lit 2-bedroom apartment, you would find Pastor James and First Lady Brenda. Their transition from a multi-million-dollar pastoral estate to subsidized government housing was a spectacular public disgrace. The federal government had seized every single asset tied to the church, leaving them entirely destitute. James spent his days sitting in a cheap, worn-out recliner staring blankly at a small television. He was stripped of his booming voice, his expensive gold watches, and his adoring congregation. Brenda, who used to spend thousands of dollars on weekly spa treatments and designer hats, now had to clip coupons just to afford basic groceries. They were absolute pariahs in the African American community. The same people who used to bow to them in the grocery store now crossed the street to avoid making eye contact. Their legacy was not one of faith or community building. It was a legacy of theft and overwhelming shame. The silence in their small apartment was deafening, a constant reminder that without their stolen money, They had absolutely nothing to say. The scene would shift again, panning down the brightly lit aisles of a discount supermarket. There, standing behind a scanning register, you would find Chloe. The woman who had built her entire identity on white privilege, generational wealth, and looking down on everyone else, was now wearing a stiff, unflattering polyester uniform. Her father had completely cut her off, refusing to associate his pristine real estate brand with her public humiliation. Because she had never bothered to get a college degree or learn a marketable skill, retail was her only survival option. But the true punishment was not just the minimum wage job. It was the absolute humiliation of her daily reality. Just last week, a woman from her former country club came through her checkout lane. Chloe had to stand there wearing a cheap name tag and bag the groceries of a woman she used to sip champagne with. She had to swallow her pride and offer a polite smile while the woman looked at her with pure, unfiltered pity. Furthermore, my corporate collection agency was actively garnishing her small paychecks to cover the $50,000 legal debt she owed me. Every time she scanned a barcode, she was reminded that she was literally working to pay my firm. The arrogant daughter-in-law who once told me to fetch her coat was now scanning barcode labels to survive. And finally, the camera would take us to a tiny, suffocatingly small studio apartment on the bad side of town. Darren was sitting on a stained mattress, bouncing a screaming infant on his knee while staring at a mountain of past due bills. Sasha had stayed just long enough to give birth. The moment she realized Darren truly had zero access to the family trust fund and no means to provide the luxury lifestyle she demanded, she packed her bags and vanished in the middle of the night. She left the baby behind, entirely unwilling to play the role of a struggling mother for a broke man. Darren, the spoiled younger brother who had coasted through life on other people's money, was now drowning in insurmountable debt and forced to be a single father. He worked grueling double shifts at a local shipping warehouse just to afford diapers and baby formula. He was completely isolated. His parents could not afford to help him, his brother was in prison, and his ex-wife wanted him dead. He spent his nights pacing the floor with a crying baby, completely crushed by the weight of a reality he was never prepared to handle. There was no grand reconciliation. There was no tearful family reunion where everyone learned their lesson and hugged it out. Society constantly tells women, especially Black women, that we need to be the bigger person. We are conditioned to forgive toxic family members in the name of keeping the peace. We are told to turn the other cheek when we are disrespected, stolen from, and humiliated by the people who are supposed to protect us. We are expected to sacrifice our own mental health to maintain the illusion of a happy family. I fundamentally reject that narrative. I did not forgive them. I did not offer them a single dime of my wealth. I did not drop the charges, and I did not feel a shred of guilt as I watched their fraudulent empire crumble to dust. They built a house out of lies, arrogance, and absolute entitlement. I simply handed them the match and watched it burn. I took the broken pieces of my life, and I built an impenetrable fortress. The financial technology firm I started in a spare bedroom had now swallowed the very bank that used to employ my ex-husband. The property where my in-laws used to preach their hypocritical sermons was officially demolished. In its place, steel beams were already rising for a sanctuary designed for real hardworking women trying to find their own financial independence. Every single thing they tried to take from me, I replaced with something 1,000 times more powerful. True justice is not about forgiveness. True justice is about absolute, undeniable consequences. The camera would finally pull back from the chaotic, miserable lives of the people who tried to destroy me. The cold, rainy nights, the sterile courtrooms, and the cramped apartments would slowly fade away into the background. The visual transitioned smoothly back to the present moment. The warm, golden ambient lighting of my luxury penthouse living room filled the frame. I was sitting comfortably on my plush velvet sofa, my legs elegantly crossed, holding a crystal glass of expensive red wine. The city of Atlanta sparkled peacefully through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind me. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine, looking directly into the lens. So here we are. The dust has completely settled. The chaotic noise of my former in-laws, The dramatic press conferences, the federal investigations, and the desperate midnight pleas in the rain are all a thing of the past. My penthouse is quiet now, but it is a beautiful, deeply comforting peace. It is the kind of peace you only find after you have successfully navigated your way through a massive storm and realized you were the one controlling the weather all along. When a stranger betrays you, you learn a hard lesson about the world. But when your own family betrays you, when the man who stood at an altar and promised to protect you decides to throw you to the wolves to save his own ego, it fundamentally reshapes your entire reality. It is the most painful, humiliating slap you can possibly experience. You spend days, sometimes years, questioning your own sanity. You wonder if you could have loved them harder, communicated better, or compromised just a little bit more to make them see your value. I spent 5 years trying to fit into a mold that was actively suffocating me. I thought my intelligence, my ambition, and my financial success were things I had to constantly apologize for. I made myself smaller so Terrence could feel like a giant. I smiled through the condescending insults from Pastor James and First Lady Brenda, because society constantly conditions us to believe that keeping the family peace is more important than protecting our own boundaries. Let us talk about the specific heavy reality of being a successful Black woman in today's society. From the time we are young girls, we are taught to be the emotional mules of the world. We are told to be strong, resilient, and independent, but never so strong that we intimidate the men around us. We are expected to carry the heavy burdens of our communities, our churches, and our families without ever asking for a lighter load. When we finally draw a line in the sand and demand basic human respect, we are immediately labeled as bitter, aggressive, or unyielding. We are told to pray away the disrespect. We are told to submit to men who do not even possess the discipline to submit to their own responsibilities. I entirely reject that narrative. I refuse to be the sacrificial lamb on the altar of a toxic family's pride. The moment Terrence stood up at my dining table and threw that glass of ice water in my face, he genuinely thought he was drowning my spirit. He thought he was putting me in my place. He had absolutely no idea that he was just washing away the last remaining ounce of compromise I had left in my soul. That slap of freezing water was the greatest gift he could have ever given me. It woke me up. It reminded me that my ultimate loyalty must always belong to myself. It forced me to stop playing the role of the submissive wife and step fully into the power of the empire I had quietly built. Financial independence is the ultimate equalizer. It is not just about wearing expensive designer clothes, driving luxury cars, or living in a beautiful high-rise penthouse. It is about the absolute, undeniable freedom to walk away from any table where respect is no longer being served. It is about looking at a room full of arrogant, privileged people who think they hold your entire fate in their hands and smiling, because you know you legally own the building. When you have your own resources, when your name is the only one on the deed, nobody can ever force you to tolerate their abuse. Chloe learned that the hard way. She relied on the privilege of her skin and the wealth of her father, but the moment she tied her survival to a corrupt man, she lost everything. My power was entirely my own. I know there are women watching this right now who are sitting in the exact same darkness I was. You are currently shrinking yourself to keep the peace in a household that does not appreciate you. You are handing over your hard-earned paychecks to men who gamble with your future. You are sitting at holiday dinners listening to toxic relatives mock your dreams, waiting for a genuine apology that is never going to come. You are hoping that if you just love them enough, they will eventually change. Stop waiting. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you. You have to be willing to be the villain in their fabricated story so you can finally be the hero in your own reality. If you are living in the darkness of a toxic family, remember, tears don't buy respect. Success does. Stop crying over people who are perfectly fine with watching you drown. Build your empire in absolute silence. Gather your receipts, protect your assets, and when the time comes, let your success be the loudest sound in the room. Please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your story in the comments below. We build our strength by sharing our truths and lifting each other up. It is time to take control of your own script. I offer a warm, genuine smile directly to the camera. I slowly raise my crystal glass of red wine, offering a silent, triumphant toast to every woman fighting for her own freedom. The screen slowly fades to black.